Thank you for joining us again for our study in the book of Isaiah. I'd like to ask, if you will, to be turning to chapter 7 as we'll begin our study of what we're going to see to be a new section. Chapter 1, verse 1 through the end of chapter 6 pretty much stands as the unit. Chapter 6, as we indicated last time, is kind of a buffer between the two. But let's hit the ground. Let's go back and make sure what we've covered. When you look at chapter 2, verse 1 through chapter 4, verse 6, we saw the picture that there were three Jerusalems that were portrayed. In chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, you got the ideal Jerusalem. And that is the one, of course, that is seen as the prophecy that was fulfilled on Pentecost Day, where it indicated that God's message was going to originate in Jerusalem, and all nations were going to be drawn to it. And it described the peace between man and God. Then when you look at chapter 2, verse 1, and you go through chapter 4, verse 1, you see what is called the real Jerusalem. In other words, Isaiah was describing Jerusalem as it was in the day when he was writing, about 740 BC, and he was describing a horrible situation that they were deep in sin. There was corruption that was going everywhere. The leaders weren't leading properly. The priests weren't doing their job. And all these consequences we see were in regard to their sin. And Isaiah described the current Jerusalem in the second. In the third, we see the redeemed Israel. That's chapter 4. Verses 2 through 6, and in essence, largely, that was talking about the remnant coming back into the land. Now, what's beautiful about that section, chapter 2, verse 1 through chapter 4, verse 6, is you've got bookends. You have chapter 2, verses 1 through 4 as a message of hope. You've got chapter 4, verses 2 through 6 as a message of hope, closing out that discussion in those chapters about Jerusalem. Then when we moved into chapter 5, we saw that parable of the vineyard. And basically what the parable portrayed was, here was an owner of a vineyard. Here was a man who took care of the crop, and he had done everything possible. He had done everything that he could have done to ensure a good harvest of those grapes. And so therefore, he expected a good harvest of grapes. But then when the grapes came in, they were sour. They were not what was expected, and it was wrong as it relates to how preparation was made for everything to be perfect. That was then spiritually applied to Jerusalem, or to the southern kingdom of Judah. God had done everything possible. He revealed his will. He had established a covenant with them. You have a priesthood put into place that should have been leading the way and teaching the people about God's way. Leaders were taught how they were to lead. You've got a bunch of covenant people that should have been bearing great fruit. This should have been a great day in Judah's history, but it was not. It was a horrific day. And so therefore, God was going to completely devastate that crop. Weeds were going to come up. It was going to be a place that was good for nothing. And so what we see was that Judah, was expected to remain in and be faithful to the covenant they had with God. God was expecting that to be the case as he put it all in place for them. But the harvest was not what God had anticipated. And so therefore, the devastation of the vineyard characterizes the consequences of Babylonian captivity that were going to come on Judah because they had failed to live up to God's expectations. Then as we move into chapter 6, we see the great call of Isaiah. And we see that Isaiah saw three things in that chapter. First of all, he saw the Lord, verses 1 through 4. You see the seraphim that are there, and they're glorifying God. He saw the glory and the magnificence of God shown to him. But then secondly, he saw himself. Woe is me, for I am undone. I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell among a people of unclean lips. As compared to the glory of God, we see the humility of Isaiah. And yet, thirdly, he saw his mission. Because God said, who am I going to send into the world? Who am I going to send on this mission of taking my message to my people? And Isaiah said, here am I, send me. Great humility, a great passage dealing with the awe, the magnificence of God, and how we are to see ourselves. When we look at the magnificence of God, there is no room for any kind of pride. There is no room for any kind of self-promotion. I've taught against something called preacher's pride for a long time. People love to put preachers on a pedestal, and it's a temptation that a lot of younger preachers really have to watch out for. But if we would just remember whose we are, it would tell us who we are and how we are to act. Well, now it's time for another history lesson as we move into chapter 7. I have some introductory thoughts. And here's what I plan on doing. We'll see how far we get with it in this lesson. I want to look at the historical background to set the stage so that we might better understand what's happening there in chapter 7. And then we're going to focus on Isaiah 7:14. That is a problem passage today. It's much debated over some particulars of that verse. But what I'm going to do is I want us to discuss the entirety of chapter 7 in its context. And then I want to come back and deal with verse 14 as it relates to the debate that's going on and the solution that I believe is the obvious one, because of the way that the New Testament quotes this passage and to whom New Testament writers applied this passage. It should help us see better the meaning, the understanding of that passage. Chapters 7 through 12 now comprise what's known as the Book of Emmanuel. Well, Emmanuel is going to be addressed, and let me just plant a seed here. Emmanuel is Christ. It's God with us, is what it's meant. We can look at Matthew chapter 1, beginning at about verse 21, and see the context there, and see very clearly this passage is quoted by Matthew, or we see Matthew penning the words that involve this prophecy, and very clearly there it's applied to Christ. So this is indeed a messianic prophecy as we move through this chapter, but where it's difficult is it's not really a passage in which the context is describing the one to come. It's a sign that is given to Ahaz, who didn't ask for a sign, who didn't want a sign. As a matter of fact, he didn't want to hear what God had to say about the situation. Well, now that I've hopefully whetted your appetite for that, let's get to the historical aspect. Now, I know some of you, I can already hear your eyes rolling back in your head. We don't like history on many occasions. But brethren, we will never understand the prophets as we need to understand them if we do not understand the historical context in which these men wrote and spoke, and to understand what was going on beneath the surface. What was going on that's not shown us in the text that resulted in the actions, the attitudes, the words that we see in the pages. We need to understand that the Bible was not written in a vacuum. It wasn't written in a historical vacuum. It wasn't written in a literary vacuum. It wasn't written in a cultural vacuum. There were things that were going on, things that were being said, things that were being read, things that were being lived that help us understand to a greater extent what's happening in this passage. Well, chapters 7 through 12 are all filled with powerful prophecies. It's the historical point in time that we want to address. Why did Ahaz do what he did? What's going on behind the scenes? What's motivating him? What is his thought process and what he's trying to accomplish here? And why is this addressed? Well, we're at a date of about 745 BC. That is about 5 years before Uzziah's death. Now let's go back just briefly. I'm not going to talk about dates or names, but there were 4 kings that were mentioned that basically serve as the time for Isaiah's prophecy. From this king through this king he ruled. Well, Uzziah was one of those. And about 5 years before Uzziah died, Tiglath-Pileser III, who was one of the generals of the Assyrian army, seized the throne in Assyria. And the first thing he attempted to do was to expand the borders of the kingdom. He began some very aggressive campaigns to bring more and more land, more and more resources into the Assyrian Empire. And Israel, Judah are very close in proximity and are going to be affected by his actions. He immediately sought world domination. They were already powerful. He wanted to see that status of world power, the world power that was gained. Well, Pekah, who was king of Israel at that time, and Rezin, R-E-Z-I-N, was king of Syria at that time, 2 countries that were close and would be affected by what Tiglath-Pileser was doing. They decided to come together and form an alliance to try to hold Assyria at bay. But not only that, they tried to force Judah into this conspiracy. Ahaz refused, and they attacked Judah in 735 BC. In one battle, 120,000 Judeans were killed, 2 Chronicles 28:6, and another 200,000 were taken captive. We read about this in Scripture, but let's get into our history books. And we need to understand what's referred to as the Syro-Ephraimitic War. And that's what's being discussed here. Well, the Arameans, who were the Syrians, they had also taken captives to Damascus, 2 Chronicles 28 and verse 5. And at the same time, now from the southwest, the Philistines began to attack. And they were raiding into the southern areas of the land that Judah held. 2 Chronicles chapter 28 and verse 18. The Edomites from the southeast were also raiding, and they were in danger of taking some of the harbors that were going to be important in that sense. Therefore, Judah was being attacked from at least 3 different directions at this point in time. Again, this is referred to historically as the Syro-Ephraimitic War. Well, Ahaz found himself quite literally between a rock and a hard place. And in dire straits, he saw no alternative but to look to Tiglath-Pileser III and try to get help from him. Well, Tiglath-Pileser III, the Assyrian army, began to move immediately to come down and to begin taking some of those who were attacking Judah out of the picture. He moved down to take the Philistines about 734 BC. Well, a year later, and here is the irony of trying to form allegiances and alliances. A year later, he struck Israel with full force. All the Israelite territories in Galilee and the Transjordan, that land on the other side of the Jordan River, were overrun. And part of that population was then carried into captivity. That's in 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 29, where we read of that biblically. Israel was saved, however, from total destruction at that time. Now remember, 734 BC, that means it's only about 12 years until they are fully carried away in Assyrian captivity. But what saved Israel from total destruction was when King Hoshea murdered Pekah. And he then surrendered to Assyria and began paying them tribute, taxes, if you will. 2 Kings chapter 15 and verse 30. Well, in 732 BC, the Assyrians then attacked Damascus. They ravaged that city, and they carried a lot of people away into captivity themselves. Judah would have been next. However, they were spared for a time because they had agreed to pay a heavy tribute to Assyria to keep from being attacked in that sense. Now, through all of this, Isaiah saw the action of Ahaz as a lack of faith in God. In 722 BC, Israel was finally devastated, and most of the inhabitants at that point were taken away into Assyrian captivity. So here's where we are historically. We're looking now that the 10 northern tribes of Israel have now fallen. They will never again have the national distinction of Israel. They're taken into Assyrian captivity. When Babylon becomes the world power, they're going to be absorbed into that kingdom, as the tribes of Judah are then also going to be brought together back with them during that time. So this is what's going on in what we see with Ahaz now. Remember, he had basically agreed to pay a heavy tribute so that he would not have been destroyed at that point. Now note through all of this that none of these people looked to God for help. Israel sought help in alliances. Prophets had been sent to them and had told them the folly of doing that. Ahaz should have looked to God for the power. Ahaz represented the Davidic line. We're going to emphasize that here in just a few more minutes. Here was a king who had a great opportunity to look to God and to draw on the strength that God said that he would provide if these people had remained faithful. Yet what did he do? He caved. And he agreed to pay a heavy tribute to save himself and his people. So here's where we're looking at this context then, the plot against King Ahaz and how the Syro-Ephraimitic War was involved. So let's look at 7 through 9 together and then discuss this section. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, that Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up to Jerusalem to make war against it, but could not prevail against it. And it was told to the house of David, saying, Syria's forces are deployed in Ephraim. So his heart and the heart of his people were moved as the trees of the woods are moved with the wind. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, Go out now to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub, your son, at the end of the aqueduct from the upper pool on the highway to the fuller's field, and say to him, Take heed and be quiet. Do not fear or be faint-hearted, for these 2 stubs of smoking firebrands, for the fierce anger of Rezin in Syria and the son of Remaliah. Because Syria, Ephraim, and the son of Remaliah have plotted evil against you, saying, Let us go up against Judah and trouble it, and let us make a gap in its wall for ourselves, and set a king over them, the son of Tabal. Thus says the Lord God, It shall not stand, nor shall it come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. Within 65 years Ephraim will be broken, so that it will not be a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is Remaliah's son. If you will not believe me, surely you shall not be established. We're talking here about the compromise that Ahaz made. He was told, don't worry. I'm going to take care of Syria. I'm going to take care of Israel. And the time is coming when they're going to be gone away. These two firebrands, they're going to disappear. All along, God wanted Ahaz and other kings in succession to come to him and not try to seek their own solutions. If Ahaz had only done that, he would have been remembered in a far greater manner, a far greater way, a lot better memory of how he was seen in history. Again, this is a reference to the Syro-Ephraimitic War. We addressed that in detail in the introductory thoughts. The kings of Israel and of Syria formed an alliance against Assyria. Ahaz refused to, and so they attacked Jerusalem to subdue it. Okay, if you won't fight with us, then we'll just take you out. Now, here's what we need to remember. If Ahaz had been taken out, if he had been removed, and another king had been put into place, that would have broken the Davidic line. Now, I want to focus on that Davidic line here again for just a moment. Ahaz represented the house of David. God had promised David that his dynasty would continue to reign over the nation. 2 Samuel chapter 7. Verses 12 through 16. Here's the passage that I use so often. Genesis chapter 49 verse 10 says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah until the one to whom it belongs, Shiloh, comes. When you look at the promise made to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, God said, I'm going to protect that kingly line, because that line is through which the one to whom it belongs will come. You see, when Genesis 49:10 was uttered, Christ was already seen as a fulfillment of it, and David was given a promise that that line was going to be kept pure. How did that happen? Well, there were 9 dynasties in the 10 northern tribes of Israel, but there was only one dynasty through all the kings in Judah's history, because God was protecting it. If Ahab had been defeated, if he had been taken down, then that line would have been broken. The one that was going to be placed there would be a puppet king for Israel and Syria. Powerful, powerful thoughts on providence. Now, when Ahaz was told about what was going to happen, his heart and the hearts of the people were shaken. Tough time. Look, I want you to imagine being in the middle of all of these armies. You're being attacked from every side, and you wonder where you're going to go. If he had only had faith in the promise that was given to David, he would have known nothing's going to happen. God was going to secure that line by taking care of him. God just wanted him to come to him and to call him, to lean on him for strength. That's why it's so sad here that Ahaz really doesn't want to hear what Isaiah has to say about a word from God. He's going to have an opportunity to ask God for a sign as to how he was going to be able to stay in place. And he had an opportunity to ask for a sign that would have given him confidence and assurance. But brethren, he already had his mind made up. He had already decided that he was going to basically bow down to Assyria and pay a heavy tribute to avoid the conflict that was coming. Interestingly, this is the only mention in Scripture of Isaiah's son, Shear-Jashub, in the Bible. And oh, I wish we could spend more time here, because Shear-Jashub means a remnant will return. Chew on that for a minute. Israel's going to be carried into captivity. Judah is going to be carried into captivity. But God still has a promise to Abraham to fulfill about the seed. And so therefore a remnant is going to come back into the land. One of the great studies that we will do is looking at the meaning of names that are given to people, because they are often so pertinent as it relates to the context of what's happening. Well, Isaiah and his son were supposed to go meet Ahaz, and they were to meet him at the end of the conduit of the upper pool. And that was on the highway to Fuller's Field, is what the text tells us. The idea of why Ahaz is there is that as king, he was probably checking his water supply. In other words, if they were going to be attacked from all these different directions, if they were going to be hemmed in within the walls around the city of Jerusalem, they needed to have ample water to be able to live through any kind of siege that came. And so quite possibly, that's where he was, that's what he was doing, was trying to check and see if the water supply was ample. Later on, Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah, all representatives of Hezekiah, would meet the Rabshakehs. This was the commander of Sennacherib's army, roughly in this same place. 4 commands were given to him there in verse 4. 2 of them are positive. Take care and be calm. 2 of them are negative. Have no fear, nor be faint-hearted. He's saying the same thing in both a positive and a negative way. Take care. Negative, have no fear. Positive, be calm. Negative, don't be faint-hearted. Again, remember the Hebrew language was very keen on repetition as a way to remember things and to learn things. Now, verses 5 and 6, Syria and Assyria were determined to capture Jerusalem, because again, their intent was to punish Ahaz, to dethrone him because he would not join their alliance against Assyria. And they were going to put the son of Tabel, Tabel, on the throne. Now, I don't have any idea who this is. He's not mentioned anywhere else in Scripture. In essence, he was a nobody. He was going to be, at best, a puppet king that Syria and Israel could control to get them to do what they wanted them to do. Verses 7 through 9, we know that this plan was destined to fail. Here is where we learn lessons about the power of the providence of God. Let's step back just a minute and remember what's going on in the overall theme of the Old Testament. In Genesis 3:14, 3:15, you've got the promise that the seed of woman is going to defeat, crush Satan. We know that seed of woman was Christ. That was a messianic prophecy. And then we see God working his plan through man. You've got that promise being made to Eve there in the garden. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, you've got 3 promises made to Abraham. That people were going to be a great nation. They were going to get a land. And through Abraham's seed, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. I've been doing my personal reading through Genesis here the last couple of days, and I've highlighted in my Bible where that promise was made to Abraham. It was restated to Isaac. It was restated to Jacob. And from Jacob, we're going to see Judah come on the scene as being the tribe through which Messiah was going to come. Yes, Jesus was indeed called the Lion from the tribe of Judah. Excuse me. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 4. God had all of this worked out before the foundation of the world. All the pieces were already put into place where God's plan could be seen. In just a little bit, it'll probably be in our next lesson, we're going to see something called the prophetic perfect. And in the Hebrew language, that is something that talks about a prophecy having already occurred, even though it was well into the future. How can that be stated? Because God already has it worked out. But here's a couple of instances where if man had his way, that line would have been broken. Our time is about up. Give me just a couple of minutes to wrap this up, and Lord willing, we'll begin here back in chapter 10, or verse 10 of chapter 7 next week. If the plan of the kings of Syria and Israel had worked, the line would have been broken because a puppet king would have been placed on there. Let's move to the book of Esther. I'll go back to the book of Esther, if you will. No, we're moving ahead to the book of Esther because it was in the time of the post-captivity era. Haman had a plot against the Jews. He was going to wipe out the Jews. But Esther comes along, I believe providentially, and stops Haman's plan that would not have brought that back. Let's realize these are not knee-jerk things. This is God providentially bringing about his will through, oftentimes, human agency and human plans. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for your desire to continue studying this book. If you will, be looking ahead to verses 10 through 17, really through 25, the whole chapter, for next time. And after we study the latter part of chapter 7, then we're going to step back and spend a little bit more time in chapter 7, verse 14. Until next time, God bless you.